Welcome everyone. Let's see, we're starting to get some participants popping in. We'll just give it 1 minute before we start the actual webinar, but while that is going to be happening, I'm going to give us some couple of housekeeping notes. First, the beginning of this webinar is going to be an audio-only conference, meaning that you'll be able to hear us, but we won't be able to hear you. Until the end, we'll do a Q&A, we'll open up the mics, and if you want to talk at that time, by all means, please do. Our presenters would really love that. The other thing I wanted to do is help you get acquainted with the chat box. So the chat, you should see a button towards the bottom of your screen. If you just kind of scroll your mouse a little bit, click on the chat, and while you are there right now, if you open it up, if you could just introduce yourselves, that would be really great. So our presenters will know who's in here, what grade level you teach. I know you filled out some stuff when you first entered into the Zoom, but if you could just do it right now in the live chat, that would greatly be appreciated. So at this time, I'm going to officially say welcome. This is Read, Inquire, Write, Reasoning and Writing with Sources Through Inquiry. And our presenters tonight are Chauncey and Mary, both at the University of Michigan. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to them so they can introduce themselves and get this webinar started.
Thanks, Ashante. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome. My name is Chauncey Montesano, and I'm a former high school history teacher, and I'm now a professor in the School of Education at the University of Michigan, focused on social studies education, research, and teacher education.
And I'm Mary Schleppergrill, also a professor at the University of Michigan School of Education, and my research is interested in the challenges of language and literacy across school subjects, especially for English language learners.
So together, we've been developing a curriculum and professional development opportunities for teachers who are interested in teaching inquiry with compelling questions and sources as a way to support students' disciplinary thinking and argument writing in particular. We're very grateful to be working with the National Council for the Social Studies and to have support from the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program and the James S. McDonnell Foundation, as well as we speak with you today.
Today is the first of a series of webinars that we're going to use to introduce you to inquiry teaching and social studies. We'll exemplify inquiry by using a curriculum called Read.Inquire.Write. Each webinar will introduce and help you use one of the disciplinary literacy tools that are part of the 15 investigations offered in the curriculum. The tools are designed to support the kind of reading, thinking, and writing that middle school social studies students need to learn to do to participate in inquiry. Today's webinar will focus specifically on what we call the Bookmark tool, a support for analyzing sources. You can download the Bookmark tool and a guide to using the Bookmark tool by clicking on the link in the chat space. When you do that, you'll get a piece of paper that looks something like this. And how the students get this is two-sided, and typically the teachers laminate it so the students can have it on their desks as they read sources and use the cues on the Bookmark tool to annotate their sources working together and in interaction with each other and the teacher. Also available at the chat space is a guide to using the Bookmark tool. This is for teachers, kind of a reminder of the things that you'll learn about in the webinar this evening. There's 2 pages that you can use and look at and learn more about the bookmark after the webinar. And just a note that we're presenting and illustrating the Bookmark tool online in this webinar, but it was designed for classroom use where students can work together to use it to analyze sources. Of course, in this particular moment, you may not be having classes with students present. And so from time to time, we'll suggest ways it could be used in an online context. We start with analyzing sources because social studies inquiry starts with thinking about evidence. Students benefit from support in making sense of and evaluating the sources they read as they gather evidence for answering an inquiry question. In future webinars, we'll introduce you to the other tools in the Read.Inquire.Write inquiry process. Today, we invite you to participate by sharing comments in the chat space. You can see the link to the chat among the icons at the bottom of the screen. And Amanda Jennings, our colleague on the project, will monitor the chat space so we can respond. So tonight we'll start by sharing some background on the Read.Inquire.Write curriculum and an overview of its features. And you can see on the slide the link to the Read.Inquire.Write curriculum online. You won't need to go there tonight, but it's for your use later. After we introduce the curriculum, we'll introduce the Bookmark tool that supports reading and analysis of sources, and we'll use the child labor investigation from the curriculum as our example. We'll model how to use the bookmark and show how students can work with it. And then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So please submit your questions and comments throughout.
Okay, first let me share an overview and some background about the Read.Inquire.Write curriculum. We've developed this curriculum over years by working closely with middle school social studies teachers who wanted to support their students' argument writing and their social studies knowledge development. They came to us with a particular concern about the standardized test scores of their African American and Latinx students, their students who were learning English, and their students with fewer financial resources. Those test scores of those students were far lower than their white English-speaking and more financially advantaged peers. So, as we were working with teachers to develop and test this curriculum, we attended very carefully to who was benefiting from the curriculum, how they were benefiting, and why we thought they were benefiting. And then we used that information to make revisions to ensure that all of the students in the classrooms we were working in would be able to engage with the curriculum and grow from their experiences with it. We partnered with teachers in designing the curriculum. We observed how teachers and students worked with the curriculum. We interviewed students and examined their writing over time. And we talked regularly with the teachers to hear their perspectives. Based on these different forms of data, we iteratively developed the curriculum over 4 years. As a result, we have a curriculum consisting of 5 investigations per grade level for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade that support students' full participation in social studies inquiry, in disciplinary thinking, and argument writing with sources. We share these resources freely on the website Mary shared with you. For each of these investigations, the Read.Inquire.Write website offers freely available PowerPoint to guide instruction, a student packet of materials, and teacher's guides, as well as samples of student writing scored using our argument writing rubrics, videos of students thinking about the material, and videos that model for students how to analyze sources using the Bookmark tool that we'll talk about tonight. In addition, we'll be adding English learner supports in English and with translations of materials in Arabic and Spanish over the coming months. We break down students' argument writing into 3 types of arguments that get increasingly complex across grades. In 6th grade, students work on what we call interpretation. This is a one-sided argument where students state and support their position without necessarily acknowledging other people's perspectives. We'll work on an interpretation investigation today. And more advanced argument writing includes what we call critique and counterargument, which are the focus of the 7th and 8th grade writing specifically. We sometimes get questions about whether you can do this, use this in high school, and the answer is certainly, and you just can know from this introduction that the materials were developed in middle school classrooms. You can look on the site for more information about this progression in writing that we lay out of interpretation, critique, and counterargument. So now let's discuss what students learn, a brief rationale, and how we go about supporting their learning in Read.Inquire.Write. So in Read.Inquire.Write classrooms, students work on key learning goals specified in the C3 framework for social studies state standards, asking questions, using disciplinary concepts and tools, analyzing and evaluating sources and evidence, and constructing and communicating arguments. We lay out the specific learning outcomes for each investigation and how they roll out over time in a scope and sequence document that's on the website under Learning Goals. We come at this from the perspective that students benefit and enjoy opportunities to dive more deeply into topics, consider complex questions and multiple perspectives, share their voice, and extend their reading, their critical reasoning and writing, as well as their discussion participation skills. Inquiry lessons get students actively involved in making sense of what they read. They're actively involved in reasoning about issues on the basis of evidence and in developing and critiquing ideas, as well as communicating their ideas clearly, orally, and through discussion and in writing.
We support students toward these goals with the 6 disciplinary literacy tools you see here on this slide. They include the tool for annotating sources that we call the bookmark that we'll focus on today. And then in further webinars, we'll introduce our Weigh the Evidence tool for drawing evidence from across sources to develop a claim, as well as 4 tools that support students in the writing process: a mentor text, planning graphic organizer, a useful language guide for meeting the disciplinary demands of argumentation, and a reflection tool to help students assess their writing and make improvements. Each of Read.Inquire.Write's 15 investigations use these same 6 tools to support students in the inquiry process as they think about a compelling question, analyze and evaluate sources, weigh evidence across sources to develop their own claims, and communicate their arguments in writing. This image shows how the disciplinary literacy tools are used across a 5-day investigation. Of course, you can adjust the number of days you spend on an investigation. Some teachers prefer to go into even greater depth and extend the investigations. Others work through them in fewer days. One key to working with any curriculum, of course, is to adapt it to suit your own needs and your own students in classroom. So we make all of our materials available as Microsoft Word documents for you to easily adapt.
And that's really important. We've got here a 5-day layout. You could think of it as 5 days. You could think of it as steps in 5 steps in an inquiry process. But I'll use this structure to highlight a typical sequence of instruction in a Read.Inquire.Write inquiry. So day 1 often involves drawing students into the inquiry by making connections to the incoming knowledge and experience they bring, extending their background knowledge and orienting to the compelling question that will guide the inquiry. Days 2 and 3 focus on reading and analysis of sources, corroborating sources, and weighing evidence in response to the compelling question that drives the inquiry. On day 4, students develop their arguments as they look at examples of other arguments, and they plan out their writing, making choices about what they will include. And then on day 5, students compose their arguments. They self-assess and reflect on their goals for writing and make 1 or 2 revisions to their first draft, perhaps making a plan for a further revision if you want to spend more time on it. And you can see from this image that there's at least 1 disciplinary literacy tool to support the intellectual work students engage in on days 2 through 5. And as Mary said, this is a process. You should adapt it to work in your classroom. The goal is to make sense of and evaluate sources, to use those sources as the basis of arguments, and to communicate the ideas through written argument. So we offer these tools as a way to structure a process to do that.
Okay, so let's get started with the Bookmark tool for supporting students' analysis of sources. We introduced the Bookmark tool first because reading, understanding, and analyzing sources sets the stage for discussion about the central question and for developing arguments in response to that question. The bookmark guides students in 3 ways of reading and discussing a source. First, through analysis of where the source is from and the perspectives it might represent. Then through close reading, using prompts that help students comprehend the source through attention to language. And then through analysis that helps them consider how relevant and useful will this source be for answering an inquiry question. Today, we'll work with the bookmark tool in the context of an investigation that asks, why does hazardous child labor continue to exist in Nepal? The investigation presents 6 sources that offer evidence from different perspectives about children's work in Nepal's brick kilns. Students read the sources to learn about child labor and to prepare to write an argument in response to that central question. Their assignment on day 5 is to write to an advocacy group, the Child Labor Coalition, to argue that evidence from the sources helps explain why hazardous child labor continues to exist in Nepal. The bookmark is used on days 2 and 3 of an investigation, after a day of connecting to the topic and extending background information. The bookmark prompts discussion of each source through its 3 parts, which you see on this slide. In part 1, students read about and discuss where the source comes from and how it came to be written. In part 2, students read the source itself, guided by a question that helps them make sense of the language and understand its meaning. And in part 3, having read the source, students evaluate it, think about evidence it offers to help them respond to the central question, and about how trustworthy the source is for thinking about why hazardous child labor continues to exist in Nepal. So we're going to take you through these 3 different parts of the bookmark tonight.
And so remember how Mary showed you the bookmark before. You can imagine students sitting with it next to their source on their desk and thinking about both the source and the bookmark together. We're going to now try using part 1 of the bookmark together with the first source in the child labor investigation, which is pictured here. So I'll first show you how you can model the use of the bookmark, and then we'll have some students work together with part 1 of the bookmark as they analyze sources. Part 1 includes a prompt to circle information about where the source comes from and what may have influenced its creation. Noticing this information is prompted by questions A through D on the upper right part of the part 1 of the bookmark. So remember, what we're trying to do as we read here, with this source, is we're trying to figure out why hazardous child labor continues to exist in Nepal's brick kilns. That's our purpose for reading, which we always want to remember. So now I'm going to model by demonstrating and thinking aloud while I use the bookmark part 1 to analyze a source. So I'm going to start modeling. So when I read a source, I first want to understand where it comes from and what might have influenced the creation of the source. So in part 1 of the bookmark, I focus on the headnote and the attribution at the top and the bottom of the source. That's where I can find information about the source and what may have influenced the creation of the source, because that has implications for what the source actually means. So I'm going to read these sections out loud as I think about questions A through D in part 1. Those questions ask, who said or wrote this? When and where was it said? What type of source is this? Why was it created? For whom was it created? And I'm going to read out loud so that everyone in the class can have access to the text. So now I'm reading the attribution at the bottom. It says, excerpt adapted from a statement by 12-year-old Kumar from Sinduli. Accessed by, well, wait a minute. Before I go on, I'm noticing that a 12-year-old whose name is Kumar is the one who shared this in a statement, but it was included in a research report. I started to read ahead there and see that that was created by a foundation focused on international children. So it says the Foundation for International Research on Working Children. So I've circled some of that information to help me keep track of where this comes from And as I'm doing that, I'm realizing this source is coming kind of from two authors in a way. There's the organization that put the report together, and then there's the child who gave a statement to the authors of the report. So I'm going to make a note in the margin to help me remember this idea that there's this child's statement and that's being reported by this organization. So now stepping out of modeling, that's an example of how I might model thinking as I read using the bookmark prompts to guide me. But modeling should be brief. We never recommend it goes very long. And then it's important to have students work with a partner to do the same kind of work, to read out loud together, to circle details that might help them understand more about who created the source, when, where, and why it was created, and what type of source it is. We encourage partner work with the bookmark because that gives every student opportunities to talk, and talking about the sources supports thinking and sense making. Obviously, we can't always do that. So for online or at-home learning, if it's possible, we recommend that students buddy up with somebody at home or another student via phone, just to have some kind of exchange and partnership in working their way through a source. Students can also work independently, but we see such growth when it's possible for students to talk with others. So we're here with other members of our team who are also teachers and researchers. Logan Island is here, and Mina Hernandez Garcia is here. And they're going to join us now. They're clearly not middle school students, so of course, they won't sound the same, but they are going to play the role of students in this webinar to help us see that while there's some modeling that happens or teacher guidance to support the use of the bookmark and reading sources, it's extremely important to have a lot of opportunities for students to talk together in pairs or small groups so that they're actively involved in reading and thinking. So Logan and Mina and Mary and I going back and forth between our roles as teachers and Logan and Mina's roles as students will help us see this kind of back and forth between teacher leading and students working it out together. So we hope this will show how there can be a lot of switching between teacher guidance and student cooperative practice to support the work of reading and analysis. I'll go ahead and model the directions I might give a class, and then Logan and Mina will pick up the work as student partners. So, class, I've just used part 1 of the bookmark to think through the attribution. So now you take a turn. With your partner, go ahead and read the headnote out loud and then pause to discuss and circle information about who said or wrote this, when and where it was said, what type of source this is, why it was created, and for whom it was created.
Okay, Mina, I'll read the headnote.
Okay.
Kumar came to the brick kiln with someone from his village. He molds bricks and does chores like cooking and getting water. His parents are paid about $5 per month. Kumar has not been to school for many years. Researchers from IREWOC visited brick kilns in Nepal and interviewed people about their experiences to create this report. IREWOC is trying to learn more about why children work in bad conditions around the world. IREWOC is also trying to find ways that governments and organizations can deal with child labor issues. There's a lot in that head note.
Yeah, so what details do we want to circle? I see that there were researchers from this foundation who visited the kilns and interviewed people, and that must be how they got Kumar's statement. I also see why IREWOC is doing this work, to learn more about children working and find ways to work with others on child labor issues. I'm going to circle the information about IREWOC visiting the kilns and interviewing people because it helps me understand who created this and what type of source it is.
Yeah, I agree. That seems important. And I also thought it was important to understand more about IREWOC. And the last 3 lines of the headnote help me with that. So I think we should circle info there. And I'll make a note to help us remember this later.
Thanks, Logan and Mina. So at this point in the class, we might debrief. We might ask students to share out what they found and what they circled. And that would be a really good time for teachers to project the source in some way so everybody can look at one source together. and circle what students identify. This creates a visual model for students, although they don't need to circle everything. You could also pause to discuss what information seems particularly important and what you might prioritize when you circle. So you can see that in part 1 of the bookmark, students are working together to understand where the source came from and what may have contributed to its creation so that they'll be able to understand it more fully. We're setting the stage here for later analysis that comes in part 3. So initially we're just noticing details and beginning to make sense of where this is coming from. And we'll see we'll use some of that information later as we draw some conclusions about the source and evaluate it. But this work can be done in partners, in small groups, and in a whole class discussion. Again, as much as possible, in as creative ways as you can think, having students talk with others about the sources they're reading supports their language development.
So let's turn now to reading the source itself using part 2 of the bookmark. We developed the approach to reading that we're going to demonstrate now in order to enable students in the classrooms where we develop the Read.Inquire.Write curriculum to get meaning from primary and secondary sources through a set of routines. The bookmark supports students to read the source closely with a partner, talking about what it means and how it offers evidence for the investigation's central question. You can see that the bookmark part 2 lists 4 questions that can be used to guide the interactive reading of a source. On each source in the student's packet, the bookmark question that we think is most useful for reading the source is identified in the upper right-hand corner. We offer different questions for reading the sources because the sources students read in social studies vary quite a lot. Some might be narratives about what people do. Others are laws or other kinds of official documents. Others might be news sources or opinions. And some might not have text at all. Students may need to read maps, charts, photographs, and other kinds of sources. So we identify one of the questions from part 2 of the bookmark for each source in a way that's relevant to the reading of that particular source to help students work with the different ways language is presented and information is organized. We're going to look at other questions later in the webinar, but now to read the interview with Kumar, the guiding question is, what parts of the source tell you what the author or people in the source think, want, or experience? Students work in pairs to read and discuss each sentence. As they interact, they talk both about the language the author has used and about the meaning related to the bookmark question. That means every student has the opportunity to understand the evidence that each source offers as they consider the central question. So let's see how Mina and Logan read this source to answer the question, what parts of the source tell you what the author or people in the source think, want, or experience?
Okay, Mina, I'll start reading the source. So we make the clay so we can make bricks. And once we're finished making the bricks, we have to start making the clay again. And so it never ends. So what's Kumar's experience? What's he telling us?
Well, it sounds like he's working a lot and he never gets a break. Let's underline this one. It never ends.
Okay, do you want to keep reading?
Yes, so I'm going to read. I don't enjoy doing this work, but I'm from a poor family, so I have to. He sure doesn't like working in the kiln.
Yeah, let's underline, I don't enjoy, and so I have to.
Okay, so I'm going to continue reading. What to do? He doesn't know what to do. Should we underline anything?
I don't think we need to underline anything there, so I'll keep reading. But next year, I do not want to come back.
Let's underline that.
So I hope you can see how this close reading helps students support each other in understanding. That contrasts with just reading the source on their own or listening to one person read the source aloud, where students are not so closely engaged. If you're teaching online, you might ask students to work with someone else in their learning context or set up online spaces where they could do the collaborative reading together. After the students have read through the text, then of course it's important to discuss what they underlined and what that helps them understand about the source. And then they make notes on the source about what they want to remember when they come back to it later, because they're going to be reading 4 sources and they'll want to come back and think about what each source told them about why child labor continues to exist in Nepal. So let's listen to Mina and Logan draw out the main meaning from this source.
So we underlined, it never ends, I don't enjoy, but I have to. And we also underlined, next year I don't want to come back. It sure doesn't sound like he's happy working.
Well, the work in the brick kilns looked hard in the video we saw. I wouldn't like to have to do that either.
Yeah, so I'm going to write a note saying the work is hard and Kumar doesn't want to keep doing it.
Okay, I'm writing, he's not happy about working in the brickyard.
So you can see the students talked briefly about what they underlined and how that helps them understand the source. In this case, the perspective of a child working in the brick kilns. They've made notes in the margins to keep track of this idea, and that will be useful to them later when they think about how to respond to the central question. This detailed reading may seem unfamiliar and awkward at first, but don't give up if the first time with your students isn't a big success. As students, especially those learning English or those for whom academic reading is challenging, as they learn to interact in this way, they'll better understand what the sources offer them and will be better positioned to talk about the evidence and the sources when they develop claims with the whole class.
Great, so now that we've read all parts of the source, we want to step back and think critically about it. So we'll use part 3 of the bookmark as a guide to help us do that. Using part 3 of the bookmark, so it's the back of the bookmark, we're going to evaluate the source and draw some conclusions about how it helps us think about the compelling question that's guiding our inquiry. This part of the bookmark work is typically a combination of partner or small group work or whole class discussion. Again, having students talk together in pairs pushes every student to talk, which supports their thinking and comprehension. We have some teachers right now who have turned these Word documents into Google Docs and have students going back and forth with teachers with comments inserted into the documents. So that's another possibility. Anytime that you want to gather thoughts collectively and give students opportunities to test their ideas, if you're in a classroom, that would be a great time to move to a whole class discussion. So with part 3, the first thing we want to do is prompt students to identify questions they have about the source as they talk with a partner. It's helpful to just pause and see what questions came up and give them an opportunity to think through those questions together as a whole class. Then have students talk about the ways in which the source is reliable for responding to the compelling question guiding the inquiry. Every source has biases. Every source represents a perspective. A trick in reading critically is to recognize the perspectives that influence the source and take that into account then as you start to draw conclusions. So thinking about reliability includes thinking about how useful or relevant a source is for the question, as well as how trustworthy it may be or how credible you may find it. There are reasons to trust and doubt any source, so it's not that we're looking for one right source. Instead, the work here is to support students in being critical about what they read. So with the Kumar source we've been working on, one way you might think about reliability here is that Kumar is reporting his perspective to the IRE-WOC Foundation. But based on this single source, we do not know if other children feel the same way. That doesn't mean the source from Kumar and IREWOC is worthless. It's still very valuable in providing insight into this person's experience, but we might want to compare it to other sources to get a larger sense of the issue. So that's an example of a question we have about the source that might lead us to wonder about its reliability, but it doesn't mean that the source itself is not useful. That's an example of how I might model one way of thinking about the source that makes me doubt its reliability. And as I've done that thinking, I've used the reasoning questions 2A, 2B, and 2E at the bottom of part 3, focused on the context of the source to help me think through that. So you can see in the a screen on the right at the sort of middle bottom where the brown sentence is as one reason why this might be considered unreliable. It's another way for students to track their thinking. And I'm going to prompt Logan and Mina now to think about reasons they might trust this source. So I've modeled one way of thinking about how it's not reliable. And I'm going to ask Logan and Mina to use the reasoning questions 1A, 1C, and 1D to help you think about who created this source and what that means for its reliability. In this case, it might be a little tricky because the actual creator is this organization, even though the organization's reporting Kumar's perspective. So Logan and Mina, to see what you think about reliability as you look at those questions.
Okay, Mina, so question 1A asks if the creator was in a good position to know about the issues.
And the creator is the IREWOC organization. Here, if you look in the head note, it says that the IREWOC organization visited the brick kilns in Nepal and interviewed people about their experiences. So that seems like they would have some insight.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Question 1C asks about the creator's point of view, and 1D asks about what the creator wants the audience to think or feel. And those questions reminded me of something we circled earlier.
Oh yeah, it said in the head note that IREWOC was trying to learn more about this issue and is trying to find ways to deal with child labor.
So that makes me think that we could say the author, IREWOC, is reliable because they've been learning about the issue and they're trying to find ways to deal with it.
Yeah, okay. So let's make a note of that.
So if this were our classroom, this could, given that conversation I as a teacher might be circulating, may have heard some of that, this could be a good stopping point to debrief and hear different ideas about reliability, or to question students and how they're thinking about reliability and push their thinking further. For the sake of time, we'll move on here to the last part of part 3 of the bookmark, talking about how the source helps us think about the central question guiding the inquiry. There's also a space in the packet that we offer for students to pull together these thoughts on the bottom of the Read.Inquire.Write sources. And this allows students to put their ideas about the source in their own words and have a way of quickly referencing the meaning of the source later in the inquiry process. The bookmark also prompts students to put a box around a segment of the source that responds to the compelling question. And this boxed quotation we have found has been very useful because it can easily then be used later as evidence in an essay by the student. It again gives students an easy way to recall their thinking across several days of an inquiry. So Logan and Mina are going to play this last piece out as students might do it in a classroom.
So how does the Kumar source help you think about why hazardous child labor continues to exist in Nepal?
Well, I can see from Kumar's experience that some families are poor and need their children to earn money.
So maybe that's a reason why hazardous child labor continues to exist. Let's write that on the source to help us remember later.
What part of the source do you think we could box to use later as evidence when we're writing?
Maybe this sentence. I don't enjoy doing this work, but I'm from a poor family, so I have to.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll box that here.
Great. So we always want to wrap up with this kind of thinking about the compelling question in light of a source that we just spent time reading. It takes so long to read and make sense of it that we want to pull those thoughts together before we move forward and read other sources. The compelling question is our purpose for reading sources and using the bookmark at all. The bookmark's there to just help us make sense of the source and help us think about that compelling question in light of the sources. It's the focus of our inquiry, so we want to consider how each source helps us think about the central question or the compelling question. On a side note, we don't recommend students use all the questions on the back of the bookmark under reasoning on part 3. These are just suggestions of different ways of breaking down the thinking that goes into determining the credibility of a source and thinking critically about a source. So these are just options to support students in learning how to do this work. Teachers can direct students' attention to specific prompts, as I did here, but they could also give students choices of what to select, and as students get more practice with it, they typically don't even need that guidance. If you are selecting which prompts might be most appropriate, I'd consider the compelling question and how the source relates to that question, as well as the details about the source's creation, and that might lead you to trust or doubt the source. So that's part 3.
Now that we've used the entire bookmark with one source, let's go back to part 2, the questions that guide students in reading the source itself, and see what other prompts support students' understanding. We don't have time today to go through each of the other sources in the child labor investigation in detail, but I'll take a few minutes to illustrate how students can work with the kinds of sources that each of the other 3 guiding questions is designed to support. For example, here we see source 3, which is a different kind of source than the interview with Kumar. This is a table that summarizes the responses of all the children who were interviewed. Like other sources that are not text, the guiding question for this source is the most general one on part 2 of the bookmark. What parts of the source seem most important for understanding and why? Depending on your students' experience reading graphs, you might want to take some time to orient them to the organization of the graph and the kind of information it provides. Once you've done that, students can work together to explore the information and identify what is most important to understanding why hazardous child labor continues to exist in Nepal. Source 4 represents a different kind of text. This is Nepal's policies against child labor. So it's the official regulations on child labor in Nepal. The guiding question for reading this source is, what people and institutions are actors in this source? What is the relationship between those people and institutions? So again, students are going to work in pairs to read and discuss the source responding to this guiding question. Of course, with your students, you'll need to introduce and practice using each of these bookmark questions. In this case, for example, drawing attention to what an institution is for this purpose and what it means that there are relationships between people and institutions. But Mina and Logan, our stand-in students for this webinar, are already familiar with the question and how to use the question to read the source, as your students will also be after they've had practice with it in your classroom. And so they're just going to show us by taking just 1 or 2 sentences from the source tonight to explore what the source says.
Okay, Mina, I'll begin reading at the beginning of the source.
Okay.
The current Child Labor Regulations and Prohibition Act of 2000 does not allow the employment of children below 16 years of age working in brick production. The people here are the children below 16 years of age, but what's the institution?
Logan, remember how the teacher told us that institutions can be organizations or they can be things like laws and documents? I think the Child Labor Regulations and Prohibition Act of 2000 is an institution.
Yeah, it's the act that says children under 16 can't work. Let's make a note of that, since we know that Kumar is only 12 and he's working in the brickyard, and we know that's against the law.
Yes, let's make a note.
We don't have time today to read more of this source, but you can see it goes on to talk about what else the Act prohibits and what other rules are in relation to child labor in Nepal. These are points that reading with the bookmark question will help the students understand. Source 6 is an article from the Christian Science Monitor, a news organization that assesses the situation for child labor in Nepal following an earthquake there in 2015 that resulted in a great need for bricks to reconstruct damaged buildings. The bookmark question we ask students to use for this source has to do with language itself. The question is, find sentences that begin with transition words or introductory phrases. What key ideas come after transition words or introductory phrases? This question helps students read across a text that is explaining something. Sentence beginnings are a useful focus, as an author often uses the beginning of a sentence to refer back to something that has already been said, or to reorient a text to make a new point. You can find more supports for helping students work with this question on the Read.Inquire.Write website. Mina and Logan have already been introduced to this as students in the classroom, and they'll use this guiding question to demonstrate how to read a newspaper source with a focus on what follows transition words or phrases.
Okay, Mina, I'll begin reading the first line of the source. Developing countries often face pressures to use child labor after natural disasters. So no transition words here.
But do you understand what it's saying? What does face pressures mean?
I think face pressures might mean that they were under a lot of stress to rebuild after the earthquake.
That makes sense. Okay, I'll read the next sentence. With widespread destruction and the need for quick progress, they must figure out how to keep reconstruction costs low while protecting their most vulnerable people. There is an introductory phrase here. With widespread destruction and the need for quick progress. It's a long sentence.
Yes, and we're supposed to look at what comes after the introductory phrase for something important. Do you understand the introductory phrase and what it means?
That after the earthquake, a lot of things were destroyed, and so they had to fix things quickly.
Yeah, I think so. Let's read the rest of the sentence again. They must figure out how to keep reconstruction costs low while protecting their most vulnerable people. So reconstruction costs, how much will it cost to fix things? While protecting their most vulnerable people. And do you know what vulnerable means?
No, but I'll look it up in the dictionary. It means at risk for harm. So maybe it means the children.
Okay, so let's underline, they must figure out how to keep reconstruction costs low while protecting their most vulnerable people. And I'm going to write a note on the side saying they want to rebuild and still protect children.
You see that the students here spent a lot of time on this sentence, but in looking at it closely, they worked together to understand what it means and how it relates to the investigation. As they move through the rest of the source, looking for transition words and introductory phrases will also encourage them to stop and look closely at other sentences, including, in Nepal, as many as 60,000 children work in brick kilns, and As reconstruction got underway, the demand for bricks doubled. Even if they don't understand everything in a challenging source, they'll focus on a reason why so many children may be working in brick kilns following the earthquake as they gather evidence for their arguments. This close work of reading sources carefully helps students develop notes on a source that will help them in the next stage of the investigation, but it also helps them recognize what they don't understand. As they read every sentence, they encounter unfamiliar vocabulary and expressions. We encourage you to allow students to encounter unfamiliar words in their contexts of use, but offer them routines they can use to search for meaning when they don't understand. Here, for example, Mina used a dictionary. In other routines, you might ask students to share what they don't understand with others in the class to get help clarifying the meaning. We haven't had time to talk through all 3 bookmark sections with each of the sources in this investigation, and we encourage you to do that on your own to become more familiar with the bookmark tool. Try using the bookmark to explore the headnotes and attributions with part 1 of the bookmark, and to explore questions of reliability of the sources for answering the central question using part 3 of the bookmark. And work through the sources with the specific questions identified for each source in part 2. You can find all of those materials on the Read.Inquire.Write website.
So at this point, we've used parts 1, 2, and 3 of the bookmark tool with one source, and we've looked at how to use different prompts from part 2 of the bookmark with different sources. And now we're going to turn to think about how this work fits into the bigger picture of a Read.Inquire.Write investigation. So in a Read.Inquire.Write investigation, were you to structure it in a 5-day sequence or 5-step sequence like this, students would use the bookmark to guide their work with multiple sources as they think about the question guiding the inquiry. In this case, why does hazardous child labor continue to exist in Nepal? And after using the bookmark tool to guide their work with individual sources, one at a time, the next step in the Read.Inquire.Write inquiry process is to think across all of the sources, to compare them, to discuss the different claims supported by the full set of evidence. The Read.Inquire.Write curriculum's second disciplinary literacy tool is called Weigh the Evidence, and the Weigh the Evidence tool supports you in facilitating a discussion with students about what the different sources have to offer in responding to the compelling question. What arguments about the compelling question can be made on the basis of these sources, and what evidence is most convincing in thinking about that compelling question.
In a 5-day investigation, it will take 3 to 4 days to develop background, read the sources, and begin to weigh the evidence to develop arguable claims. On day 4, students make decisions about what they will write, review a mentor text, and outline their arguments with a planning graphic organizer. On day 5, they write using the useful language tool and the reflection tool. Each of these tools will be the focus of another webinar in this series.
At the beginning of the webinar, we shared a link to a guide that can support you in teaching students to use the bookmark tool. Mary showed you this tool as we open the webinar as well. The guide sketches out the teaching work involved in guiding students through reading and analyzing sources using the bookmark tool. This slide here shows the guide for parts 1 and 2 of the bookmark, and this slide shows the guide for teaching with part 3 of the bookmark. The approach to using the bookmark tool illustrated in the guide is based on what we've seen work in classrooms where a range of students have grown significantly in their argument writing and in their discussion participation. In these classrooms, teachers guide their students through different opportunities to talk together and think as they work with the sources. In these classrooms, reading sources is not just quiet time. It's not just individual work time. Instead, students work in pairs on their own and in small groups and as a whole class, mixing between participation structures as they work with the bookmark and with sources.
We want to show you an example of what this looked like in one teacher's classroom when he modeled and guided 7th grade students in using part 1 of the bookmark with the same child labor source we've looked at today.
Let's focus today on who wrote this, when it was written, and where it was written, or said, written, spoken, made. We're going to focus on who, when, and where, and I'm going to do the attribution. Follow along. You can underline what I underline. If you want to do something a little different, there's no problem with that. Attribution. Excerpt adapted from a statement by a 12-year-old Kumar. I'm going to underline that because that's the guy who said this stuff, from Sindhuli. Accessed from a 2010 research report. So the person that made this document got it from this research report called Child Labor in Kathmandu. I'm going to write, that sounds official. Kind of makes me think I can trust this because, wow, this seems like an important thing. By Arwi Walk, and I wonder, what's that? But I'm going to keep reading. The Foundation for the International Research on Working Children. Ooh, that sounds official too. At your table, if you have 3 or 2 people, you're going to do table reading. When one of you reads a sentence, you all decide what to underline. Another person reads the next sentence, you all decide what to underline. If you're at a table of 4, do that in pairs, partner reading. Gino, what are we doing? Should I hear anything, AI? Yes, what should I hear? And then after people read the sentences, Ali, what should I hear? Deciding what to underline. This is a collaborative group effort. I got about 5 sentences. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes. Go.
So we're up close to the end of the time, but we have just a moment for questions if anyone has any at this point. And if not, I think we are coming to the end of our time.
Yeah, if you want to add any into the chat, you can add any into the chat, or you can turn on your audio and share. And you can also reach both of us by email, or go to the Read.Inquire.Write website, and there's a link for email there as well. All right, well, I'm not hearing anybody raising a hand yet, so I'll just say thank you so much for joining us today. We've found that through learning about the bookmark tool, it's been useful for students and for teachers. We hope you've gained some insight into how to support students as they make sense of and analyze sources during social studies inquiry lessons. You can use this tool with your own set of sources or as an embedded part of the Read.Inquire.Write curriculum. And you can find the complete tool and curriculum and examples of how to integrate the tool with primary source sets from other organizations on the Read.Inquire.Write website. And we look forward to sharing our second disciplinary literacy tool, the Weigh the Evidence tool, in another webinar at some point to support students' social studies inquiry with sources. So thank you so much, and we hope you are staying well. I see one moment in the chat. Thank you, Carly. Appreciate your note. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.